All right. Good day, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. This is Matthew McQueenie from Conabos, and welcome to October's DX Cafe event with our special guest, Josefine Schaefer, the Developer Relations Engineer at Storyblock. Josephine is going to speak a lot about web accessibility, and then we added the in the composable world part because everything's about composability and headless these days, and I think she'll probably speak to the fact that it's all very connected and aligned. Just as a little open into this, I wanted to note that this month, October, in the USA, is what's called NDAM, NDAM, and that stands for National Disability Employment Awareness Month. And it's run by the Department of Labor, and it really tries to showcase and highlight the employment experience for those with disabilities. And not that accessibility is all about disabilities, but I think we'll find it is very connected. So we did want to make mention of that, being the month of October, trying to do our part in this composable headless DXP world. So first I'd like to say, Josephine, welcome. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Sure. So I'm going to let you walk through your presentation, but I wanted to ask two quick questions. And we will have questions at the end after Josephine's presentation. So you'll put your questions in whatever format you're watching this in, whether it's YouTube, LinkedIn, even those maybe on Facebook. We will answer those questions and have them queued up here at the end. But I wanted to ask two to you, Josephine, to kind of introduce this. One, I have heard of a sales engineer. I've heard of developer relations. What is a developer relations engineer?
It does sound fancy, doesn't it? Yeah, I constantly learn about new facets of this whole discipline. So there's many different facets of this, right? So what we do is basically we try to make the engineer's job easier or as easy as possible. And for Storyblock, that means writing documentation, maybe talking to developers who work on projects, try to cooperate with partners and agencies, and just, make their life easier by providing good documentation and, try and help in any way, I guess.
No, of course. And Storyblock has a very, very good partner program from what we've experienced. The other question I wanted to ask, the elephant in the room, if you will, what led you to the specific topic of web accessibility?
So I originally come from an online marketing or communications background, and then I did a programming boot camp and shifted into front-end engineering, right? And from the first job I had, which was at a big agency, we were working on this big client and they had to implement accessibility because some of the markets where they wanted to be active, there it was a legal requirement. So I was completely new to everything. And I was just like thrown in and they said like, okay, this is our deadline. We need to fix this. And this is how I got into web accessibility, never left again.
Wow. Yeah, no, that is a great point. I think over the years, when we build digital experience projects, websites, applications, it often feels like or seems like the afterthought at times because those who are, quote unquote, able-bodied don't necessarily put themselves in the shoes of the customers who might have disabilities, might not be able to experience it the way that we can. And I think it's sometimes seen almost as a tax over the years. But as we've come to now, a lot of the, we see the cookie things all over, GDPR, all this. There's so much that goes into the digital experience and the customer experience. And if you're not keeping an eye on these from the beginning of the project, not only is it going to hurt, your company's efforts with your digital experience, but it's actually kind of hurting your ability to reach all customers. So that's my editorializing. Why don't I let you start your presentation, and thanks again for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. All right, so let me get started. First of all, thanks everybody for joining. It's really a pleasure to be here. In the next roughly 30 minutes-ish, I will be talking about how you can set up yourself and your team for success when it comes to creating accessible content and reach a wide audience. And we're going to have a brief look at the basics of web accessibility, what it really means, what role the CMS plays in this, and speaking of the world of composability, right? What does that have to do with everything, and how it all comes together when it comes to creating accessible content. Really, really quickly about me before we got started. I already said my name's Josefine. I switched from working in the communications area to front end, and now I work as a developer relations engineer at Storyblock. Storyblock is a headless CMS. And I'm, as you can probably guess from the topic of this talk, I'm an accessibility advocate, and I'm also a Girl Code ambassador. That's an initiative for women in the tech industry to spread more equality. Check them out if you're interested in that. And so if you have any questions, either throughout, I'm sure there's time afterwards, but if something comes up afterwards, you can always reach me on Twitter or on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to discuss all things accessibility, headless, you name it. All right, let's dive right in. Let's start with a short introduction of web accessibility and how we can make our web more inclusive and more accessible. So web accessibility basically means that websites, tools, and technologies are designed and implemented in a way that people with disabilities can use them and participate equally on the web. And it's also a basic human right as defined by the United Nations. And if you're wondering whether web accessibility is something that you should care about or that's right for your project, I have a really big number for you. So based on the World Report of Disability by the World Health Organization, they found that worldwide over 15% of the population experience some form of disability throughout their life. And that's 1 billion people. And even if global data is really hard to measure, and the experience of disability, of course, as well, even if it's just a ballpark, in my opinion, it's a really powerful one. And of course, as a society, we're growing older, our needs are changing, so this number is only going to get larger eventually. And so I'm hoping that even if you are looking at this from a business perspective, that the sheer amount of people who are affected and their massive spending power convinces you that this is relevant also for you. And if that's not enough, here in this table, it shows different kinds of many potential users. So we have different kinds of disabilities or impairments like physical, auditory, cognitive, neurological, speech or visual disability, but it also shows people without disabilities. So this is called in this table temporary or situational limitation. So it could be maybe a broken arm, or maybe a new parent holding a baby, so you just have one arm to do things. You could be that you have a terrible internet connection, or maybe you are in a space where you can't turn up the volume, or trying to access the internet through a really small or different device maybe, or even like bright sunlight shining on your screen, and it's going to be really hard to read things, right? So all of these are cases in which web accessibility is going to be beneficial for all of us. So in practice, that looks like, well, that has many different phases, right? So for example, could mean color contrast, so providing enough contrast between the background and the foreground so that information is perceivable. It could mean being open to different input methods, not only the mouse, but also the keyboard, or maybe assistive technology. It means using Semantic HTML to provide context for example, for screen readers. So, and also explaining unfamiliar terms and being mindful of the language that we use, and explaining things and not assuming that everybody has the same base knowledge, kind of. Now, you might be wondering, but what does that have to do with the CMS? Well, maybe at first glance, the choice of CMS seems a bit secondary, but actually in your content management system is where it all comes together, right? So using the right CMS, you can actually create the best possible conditions for your team to create engaging and accessible content. And so the CMS should actually support you and not hinder you, so that you can focus on what really matters to you, your brand, your organization. And then headless or composability is a big hype, right? Everybody's talking about it. And if you're new to this, it basically means that we have, in the world of content management systems, we have two kind of big breeds of CMS, if you will. So we have monolithic and headless CMS. And headless CMSs were kind of created urging from the shift towards an omni-channel experience and the need for more mobile websites, because it really helps push your content towards different kinds of channels and supporting different formats. It means that the front end and the back end are completely decoupled from each other. And this way you have a lot of independence between the different disciplines. So for example, the developer team can work with their favorite technologies or their favorite tech stack. They are not depending on some sort of legacy framework or technology that they have to use, maybe because the CMS is built in that. And on the other hand, your marketing team, your editing team can work completely independently from the code base. And these two don't necessarily hinder each other, but can work independently. And of course, user experience, developer experience come as first-class citizens in a headless system, because you can use whatever you prefer, basically. And the entire thing is scalable and lets you reuse your content in many different channels, because everything is extendable through API as well. So that kind of explains the buzz, I think. Now, there are many different content management systems out there, and there are very big differences between them. And of course, it depends on your needs, which one might be best for you. So I'm going to talk about some concrete features and maybe benefits. And these are related to Storyblock, just as an example, because that's the headless system I'm most familiar with. But in general, if you're interested in that, they all have different perks, I guess. So at Storyblock, we have a visual editor where you can see real-time changes. We support headless e-commerce. You can basically plug in any kind of thing that you want through the APIs. You have content authoring tools or for content planning, discussions, features, connect to e-commerce systems, and there's no limits when it comes to internationalization and personalization. So you don't have to kind of, you don't have to limit yourself when it comes to all these business needs, if you will. Now, is headless accessible? Well, we have talked a lot about accessibility, and you're probably wondering now whether, if I switch to a headless system, does that make everything automatically accessible? And well, no, it depends a little bit. So unfortunately, neither monolithic nor headless systems are inherently accessible. But there are many things you can do in a headless system to make it a bit easier for your team to create accessible content. And we're going to have a look at what these can be. So many of the benefits that make headless CMSs so popular also actually benefit web accessibility. So it's basically a win-win. You have, for example, I already mentioned this, flexibility when it comes to tooling. So you are not limited in your choice of tools by a predefined set, but you rather can pick and choose what fits your needs best. You can work with your favorite tech stack, and you can customize the whole thing and extend it to your needs. And you can also adjust to accessibility needs and requirements to your liking. So we're going to have a look at what this means in practice in a second, and I'm going to show you with the example of Storyblock how you can set up your CMS for success in that regard. So let's dive right in. Let's talk a bit about the different things that we have to, or we can pay attention to when it comes to accessibility. And one of the number one issues is color contrast, actually. So I already mentioned it's the ratio between the foreground and the background. You see many different examples here. So the one in the middle, 4.5 to 1, is actually the minimum to pass WCAG AA standard. That's a mouthful. That's a unified standard that people decide to comply with, basically. It's kind of a shared international standard. So this is what we're aiming for, but of course, black writing on white background has even more contrast. And then on the far left, this is really hard to read as it is, and it's going to be almost impossible to read in bright sunlight, for example. And there are some other things to consider. So of course, you want high enough contrast for your content to be perceivable. There's also things to consider if you're looking out for people, for example, who are neurodivergent. They're like really bright, flashy colors might be very distracting. So that's also something to consider. So what you can do, first of all, to check whether your colors are compliant, there are some tools. I'm happy to share the link to this tool later, but if you search for a color contrast checker, there's many different options and they're all great. So you see, I did this on our own homepage, and nobody's perfect, so we can definitely all improve. And you see, I checked for this button and the contrast to the writing, and we see we have a score of 2.63, so that's failing AA level because we're not passing the 4.5. You can use these tools to kind of check whether you are compliant. What you can do within Storyblok, so this doesn't happen to your brand, is predefined color options. So instead of letting everybody pick and choose the colors to their liking and maybe even messing up a bit with your brand colors, you can predefine sets of colors in specific combinations that your editors then can choose from. And with less options, you're less prone to error, right? And you have the power to define these accessible colors instead of using a color picker, for example, because, well, too much freedom and people will use it, right? So we need to be mindful of that. And if you are in the amazing position to actually define or rethink your brand colors, there are some great tools to help you also with picking an accessible color scheme. It doesn't have to be boring at all. This is colorsave.co, I think. And they just, you give an indication what you want, and they give you different options that would all be accessible. So this is definitely something to play around with, well, if you can still rethink brand colors. Another thing that's also very important for visual context is providing alternative texts, right? So I talked a little bit about earlier that we need to provide context for screen readers and assistive technologies. And what they would do is basically crawl the page and crawl the HTML a little bit like a search engine crawler. And then if there's an image and the person can't see what's on the image, they still need to know, right? So that's why we provide the alternative text. And you see here we have an image and there is an alternative text on the right. It's a bit small. It says picture of Nicolas Coa. And so this is super important to provide context. You can do make this a requirement in Storyblok, for example, or in your Headless CMS. So you could say, well, first of all, we have a field for adding alternative text. And that's also helpful if the image can't be loaded due to a bad network connection, for example. It also helps for SEO. And you can even make it a requirement in your settings and say, okay, so alternative text, even if it gets hectic, we don't want them to be forgotten. So we're adding them and making them a requirement. And the same goes also for captions, for example. And as I mentioned already, it's also going to benefit your SEO. So it's definitely a win-win if you are able to do that. Another important topic is also, well, Headless is based on the idea of atomic design, right? We talk about composable. We want to reuse components and share them, save our own time. And also, this benefits user experience a lot because it makes things a lot easier to find and more straightforward if the UI is actually recognizable and users can kind of use the behavior they learned and apply that to the different stages of the page, right? And it's, well, that's good for everybody. I'm sure you all know that one website where you're just utterly confused because nothing is where it's supposed to be. Things look different. And you maybe have weird hover states and it's just all over the place. But these things are especially important for folks who are neurodivergent. it's going to make it a bunch easier for them to actually get the task done that they came to do. Next up, I want to talk about Semantic HTML, also something I mentioned a little earlier as one of the foundations of web accessibility. So this basically refers to using the HTML elements in the way they were intended. And by doing that, we inherently provide context for assistive technologies. So rather than wrapping a div in a div in a div, we research the correct HTML elements and use them in the way that they were intended, not only, well, I mean, we can still style a div using CSS and give it functionality, for example, with JavaScript. But many semantic HTML elements, if we use them the right way, they don't only bring the inherent keyboard accessibility, for example, which is super important, and we don't have to implement that then afterwards. But also it's going to help the editors, right? And what you can do in your headless CMS would be, for example, you can stop editors from writing markup in your CMS, because it's really hard to test and it's going to get messy very quickly. And you could also create rules that only allow specific components to be used on specific pages or in specific stories, for example, to make sure that there's only one H1 and that doesn't get like super messy in terms of landmark structure and hierarchies. You can, of course, also implement this logic in the code to make sure the hierarchies are rendered in the correct way. But that's really important, because if you want to reuse things, you want to make sure it doesn't mess up your structure, right? So that's definitely something to think about. Then I also mentioned this in the beginning just because we're really happy about this. A headless CMS is by default infinitely extendable, and you can integrate any kind of tool via API that you want. You can follow the best of breed approach, so picking the tool that actually does what you want it to do instead of buying into a whole package and not being able to customize that. You can create your own field types, you can create your own extensions, and if you wanted to, you could also add tools to do accessibility checks or identify problems. And yeah, you can even build your own if you wanted to. Of course, this is also something to pay attention to. Whatever tool you use, you will need to make sure that it's accessible, right? So because your entire project is only as accessible as your least accessible plugin. So that can really mess with everything. So really be careful about that. And also, people focus a lot on performance, and it's such a buzzword, and accessibility often gets treated, like Matt said in the beginning, a little bit like an afterthought. But actually, performance is accessibility, right? So if you are working on performance already, this will improve the accessibility of your project. For example, if your page loads really slowly, it's inaccessible for people who might not have like a super fast internet connection. So it's definitely worth investing into increasing page speed and up your performance, and look into how you can optimize, for example, the image sizes for the different viewports so that you don't load too much data there. And another important topic that you could improve with headless CMS would be accessible iframes. So when you're embedding a video from YouTube or Vimeo, for example, you can make sure to have an accessible, you want to have the keyboard controls for your video, right, that the user is actually expecting. Because there's nothing more annoying than if a video with sound starts and you're unable to stop it because the keyboard navigation doesn't work, for example, right? It's really annoying. So it would be good practice to have also a title attribute to the iframe so that you have, again, context for your screen reader. And what you could do there with Storyblock would be creating a nestable component with two field types and then text fields, and one of them is URL and the other is the title, so that you can make sure it's included everywhere, especially if you make it a requirement, it doesn't get forgotten. And I mean, this doesn't only apply to accessibility, nor only to headless CMSs. This, I guess, applies to everything, but communication is key, right? So You can, for example, use these description fields in your CMS to include notes for editors to make it easier to stick to agreed upon rules, especially when in the day-to-day work things get hectic. And just continue exchanging ideas and learning together, because this is an ongoing field and there's new things every day, and it's important to keep talking about it and improving. And of course, whatever you do, you will still need to test both automatically and also manually to make sure all your content is accessible and stays that way, right? So Headless is definitely not accessible by nature or just naturally creates only accessible content, but it hopefully gives you the flexibility to set up your systems to fit your needs and make time and space for your team to actually deal with accessibility challenges. It lets you use external tools, it lets you create your own, and lets you excel in terms of performance as well. All the different disciplines can work independently and autonomously, hopefully also giving them some headspace to focus on other things that maybe there is usually no time for. And another big benefit is that you don't have any technical debt per se. So of course that doesn't extend to your own projects, but from the CMS side, what you create is what you get. And so this really helps. You can create your own processes, your own structures, and you have full control over all of that. So there are no predefined inaccessible themes, for example, and you can create and define everything yourself, and you can own that. So it's really good conditions to create accessible content. And that was already so far all from my side. There are many good reasons to focus on accessibility. And if you have the chance to choose a CMS, choose one that enables your team rather than hindering it, and that makes it easy to get the job done that you came to do. And yeah, when it comes to accessibility, 10% is definitely better than nothing. And even if it is a bit overwhelming, it's definitely worth getting started and will make a big difference for a really large audience. So thank you so much. And let's make the web more accessible step by step.
Well, thanks so much, Josephine. This was a really great presentation. I know we have we have a handful of questions. Actually, I didn't want to cut you off here, but we'll kind of go through them, and I have some as well.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
why don't we start with the first one from Gustavo, which is, when should accessibility be raised in the life of a project, your project? You know, like we talked about it being an afterthought sometimes. I mean, I'm guessing you'll say at the beginning, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned it also already in the beginning, right? And you can always start. It's not like it's too late if you haven't thought about it from the beginning. It is going to make your life a lot easier if you consider it right from the start, that's for sure. But it's never too late. And especially, I mean, you have seen what I showed with the color contrast for the brand colors, right? If you consider it from the beginning, this is something that you can keep in your design and then implement correctly. But it's not too late to go back and change it.
And, you know, we'll go to this one next. I wanted to ask one on the point about when you should start, because one thing that's been a little bit of revelatory for me in watching this presentation today is that, which we said in the beginning, that accessibility is not necessarily about disability. It's about making your web experience, your digital experience, accessible to the most amount of people as possible. And it makes me think of one website launch that I was a part of, and the target audience was supposed to be middle-aged folks who might access most of their computing from a local library, because it was for those who might have been hurt by the workplace, out of a job, and it was this organization that was trying to help this particular group get jobs, right? So in that case, accessibility was, you brought it up there, maybe not having a great internet connection, maybe having to be connected from a computer that's going to be used by a lot of other people. And while us high-level technologists might look at the site and the experience and say, oh, that doesn't make sense, it did because we were speaking specifically to the accessibility of the target audience. So that's probably something we should consider, right?
Absolutely. And there are so many more cases. I also always, when things are, for example, timed on your, if you have to fill in a form, there's no way to save it. And then you see a clock ticking down, and imagine you have like an urgent need. Maybe there's this child screaming, or your pet ate a plant that it shouldn't. I don't know, whatever your situation is, right? And you need to rush to that, and then it's gone. And it's such an uncomfortable experience. You're not going to go back if you can avoid that. So we should all think about these different scenarios. Absolutely, yeah.
That's great. Well, let's look at this next question here. With so many standards for accessibility in each country, is there a global standard we need to, or maybe the question is we could follow to make things a little easier for us?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, I mean, it's true that things are very different for each country, but as far as I'm aware, there's the WCAG. There are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I always struggle with saying that. And these guidelines are the shared international standard that most official points refer to. And if there are things that are specific to your maybe business sector or some governmental organization, they might have different needs. That's on top, but I would always go back to them.
Great. I think we have some more. Our question maker, could we put a new question banner up? Okay. What is the best way to approach web accessibility with your project and team? Should it be a separate team, or should the existing team have some level of that discipline within it?
Yeah. I guess that really depends on the size and on the structure of how that could go. I recently listened to another webinar where people were talking about having accessibility kind of coaches. So you would get somebody who's like very, very skilled, who can then enable the individual teams to have a bit of existing knowledge and dive deeper. And whenever they would get stuck, they could go to that person to get unstuck and get some help, which I thought was a really, really cool approach. But it depends, right? If you have lots of people who have the time and the resources to get a bit, maybe learn and dig deeper there, then you can also spread it out. There is no cookie cutter answer, I'm guessing.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're talking, as we said earlier, in National Disability Employment Awareness Month here in America, and I've heard of companies, at least from the QA standpoint, who I think it was in the Netherlands, and it might have been a father who had a son with autism, and they were able to create a company that were able to employ a lot of individuals with autism because they were especially good. I'm not saying all, right? I want to be careful, but they were especially good at QA because they could kind of go through these rote scripts that you continually need to do and really surface things that others might get, that others might get distracted by. But I wonder too, on the follow up to that point, it's probably a good place for when we're talking about the disability end of accessibility. It's a good place for employment. You could have the folks who are in the shoes of these experiences potentially providing input into the experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that would be ideal, right? If you have people who are actually natives, for example, in terms of keyboard accessibility or when it comes to color, and of course, they're so much more versed in how do I do this? What are the shortcuts? People who like learn this as a second nature, if you will, they will never be as good as dealing with screen readers, for example, just because, of course, it's like learning a foreign language, right? Yeah, it's a skill that you have to acquire. And so, if you can employ people who know this firsthand, even better. Absolutely, yeah.
All right, so we have another question here. Is language or multi-language support a consideration for accessibility?
That's such an interesting question. So in terms of, I'm assuming not everybody is native, so I'm providing different languages, right? Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. If you can, and if you're catering to different markets, that is definitely something to consider. And also,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna I was just gonna say I've seen where, from the developer experience, where the developer or the agency needs to maintain multi-language support, the the team, let's say, might be English speaking, and so I've seen where the front end of the website is the language of the region that the website is being served to, but the back end labels might still be in English to help guide that experience.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. Yeah, I was just thinking that there's also such thing as, I'm not sure what it's called in English because English is not my first language, but simple language, or you have an option to switch to like an easier version, a simplified English or something. We have that, at least in Germany, also for governmental organizations, where you have the option to switch these really bureaucratic, difficult terms up for something easier, shorter sentences, and easier to understand.
That's very interesting. Okay. Now we know that Storyblock is a headless CMS. So when considering accessibility in a headless CMS, is your focus more on the developer experience accessibility or the end consumer accessibility? And I think with this question, the reason I would say this is in this decoupled architecture where you're kind of not on, I don't want to say on the hook for the front end experience like you might have been in the web, but almost as a follow up on this, when your answer is, can you be super cognizant of the end consumer accessibility when it's decoupled from the back end?
Right. Well, I guess it's really hard to separate the two in that way, right? Because they go hand in hand. So I can make sure that in my code base, I'm structuring everything correctly. Maybe I get to use a framework that I'm very comfortable in. So I already know everything, how I can structure it to be A, performant, and then B, structured in a way that makes sense when it comes out on the other side. And at the same time, do everything you can in the CMS to set up the editing team for success and structure it correctly, right? So that these two then go hand in hand when the content is finally delivered, because you both affect what's out there in the front end, right?
Yeah, no, that's really good. Okay, so Nikki Thomas says, thanks so much, Josephine. Super practical tips. So maybe the one, I think those were the banner questions we had there. The one I might ask, going back to when we can assimilate accessibility into the conversation, and I'm almost thinking that it should potentially be at that right at that portion of when we're thinking of our target audience, or as they say, our ICP, our ideal customer profile, and really in our research, going through that and allowing the accessibility needs, as well as those things we really should be doing for folks with disabilities, but allow the target audience's needs, or the audience we aspirationally want, that we're servicing, where they could have that old word, pain points. I'm sure accessibility brings to life a lot of those pain points.
Absolutely. And it can totally help to develop kind of personas, right? Think of who might use your product, and it's not all going to be, like you mentioned earlier, developer or highly technical folks with the latest MacBook or whatever, whatever might be your jam. It might also be your grandma, or somebody very distracted with a really busy life, trying to figure something out on the commute on their phone. So you really want to take real life situations into consideration when creating these personas, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm always struck still at the statistics of the amount of people who are still on America online, right? So, and it's not insignificant. It's there's still meaningful numbers in some of these digitally mature systems and digitally mature folks. So, well, Josephine, if you had, I'll let you give any closing thoughts. I know you're about to jet set around the world here. but we really do appreciate you coming on this DX Cafe to discuss accessibility in the composable world, especially. And yeah, we really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.